Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast with Joe. Joe, for everyone out there listening who might not know who you are, would you like to tell everybody a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm Joe Braun. I'm an associate professor of epidemiology at the Braun University School of Public Health and the director of the Center for Children's Environmental Health. I'm a PhD trained epidemiologist and also a registered nurse, and have been working in the field of environmental epidemiology for over 15 years, studying how environmental chemicals in our everyday lives impact the health and development of children, but also pregnant women and adults.
So my first thought that just came to my head was how many women during the 80s, during the 90s, the big hair days were spraying hairspray. Maybe they weren't smoking a cigarette because they were pregnant, but they were spraying hairspray. I mean, a whole can. That had to do some damage. That had to do something. And maybe that's why I like Kiss so much. I don't know.
So there is a lot of we are concerned a lot about these things that are in things like hairspray products and hair products. And in fact, we have found previously in some of our work that use of hair products, cologne, cosmetics is associated with increased levels of some chemicals in our bodies, including some of these phthalates that may have anti-androgenic effects. So they reduce testosterone levels. We've also found higher levels of parabens in people who use these products. And a colleague of mine up at Harvard, Tamara James Todd, has done work documenting the types of products that are often used in African American or other minority communities, where they're marketed with different beauty standards, and sometimes those products contain things like placenta, like sheep placenta, or other like really biologically active stuff that people will put on their hair and bodies. And so there's a lot of things that are out there that are marketed towards people and largely unregulated in terms of what their potential health effects could be.
Well, there's even in Africa, they do this thing where they take, is it bouillon cubes? And they take the actual cube, they melt it, and they take that little serum or whatever it's melted into, and they inject it into their butt to make their butt bigger, because that's a custom of having like a woman should have a huge butt. That's how they say it. There's a whole documentary about it, but it's like, now we can recognize that over here as like, that's a dangerous thing. That's a custom over there, but you can see that's a dangerous toxic that you're putting into your body. But there's a lot of stuff where like you might know and you might see where you're like, that's so dangerous, you shouldn't do that. But the general public does it on a daily basis and doesn't even think twice about it. I became more aware of phthalates when I heard Shanna Swan talk about phthalates and how it's reduced our testosterone and sexual, I guess, reproduction efforts from like 97% to 40-something%, which, I mean, plastic's in everything. If there's a little bit of plastic in our blood, it just starts going to this point of like, how can we help fix? How can we reduce? What should we be aware of? I mean, what's the first chemical that comes to your mind as something that people use on a daily basis?
Well, I think, the one I think of, our phthalates are a great example. And, they've been dubbed the everywhere chemical because they are everywhere. They're in so many things. And it's in some ways it's hard to keep, it's hard to keep it straight sometimes. They can be in everything from, I mentioned personal care products like cosmetics, lotions, hairsprays. They can also be in things like the building materials that we're, in the rooms we're sitting in, the things like, the carpet backing and adhesives that bind things together, in our electronics to make, plastics. They're used to make plastics flexible. So anytime you have like flexible plastic, like, the flexi tubes, they're in those. For a long time, they were used in hospital IV bags and tubing. Sometimes, as high as 30% weight of these phthalates were in these tubing bags. And, people were getting mega doses of these whenever they would get, a blood transfusion or an IV bag in the hospital. Now, of course, they needed that blood or that IV bag, but at the same time, they were getting dosed with phthalates. And then they're even used, they've even been used in things like medications as inactive ingredients. So some people who take certain medications have astronomically high levels of some phthalates. And again, but again, they're everywhere. So keeping track of them is really hard.
So how do you limit the amount that you consume with it? I mean, I know people talk about like, reusable water bottles or something of that sort, but it seems like everywhere you look, it's really incorporated into our system. I mean, I just think it's not super new research, but it is new to the public, I would say, when it comes to like plastic consumption and it comes to all these environmental aspects like BPA stuff on water bottles. And, these are all factors that are starting to be more known now, but for the longest time they weren't. And you can't make up for really all the time that it was being used, but it's also not really being corrected in a sense as well either. I mean, there's still dangerous parts of it that we're still doing, and we're still going by old methods just because we really haven't prioritized looking for another avenue, if I'm not wrong.
I think you bring up a great point, actually. I think, and I've been thinking about this more and more lately, because I think there's a big push now to think about plastics and like, what do we do? Why do we use so much plastic? And, plastic use is expected to grow over the next decade. And, and the latest stat that I saw was, only 5% of plastics in this country are recycled. So there's just this huge environmental impact. We just consume a ton of plastics, and for single use, right? The raspberry container you buy at the berry container you buy at the store, the plastic water bottle, right? There's the plastic bag I got at CVS this morning, right? So that it's all of this stuff, and we just throw it away. And we can try to reduce it, recycle it, reuse it, that mantra. But that's saying you have to do something. Me and you have to do something individually. All of us, all of your listeners out there individually have to do something. But it's not saying, it's not putting the responsibility back on the manufacturer and the whole system to say, hey, why do you keep manufacturing stuff that's totally not recyclable? It's not reusable in any way, and it's just going to go into a landfill. And why do we have to keep doing that? And it's much like it's the recycling myth that has been pushed on us by the beverage industry for decades. Back in the 80s, I was a child of the 80s, and it was always the recycling thing. And that was pushed out a lot by Coca-Cola and other big manufacturers, to clean up their image around the waste that was being produced from a lot of single-use containers. So I think that's one big aspect of it that we need to change, is just how do we change our relationship with disposable and single-use items so that we're not using them as much, or if we are, they're made in such a way that they're recyclable, compostable, or some way that they're environmentally neutral.
Well, does it rely more on the companies, or does it rely more on people? I feel like you can easily wake a lot of people up to the dangers of it if you realize that it's impacting their lives right now and it's making them less of a person. I think when everyone heard that the fertility number dropped, or at least the people that do know about it, that's a big shock. But I mean, it's enough to make you aware that, oh my God, better have kids now. But when it comes to, you know, are you still using plastics? Are you still doing this? I mean, does it rely on businesses? I mean, I remember when Sun Chips, that loud bag that everyone used to complain about, that was biodegradable, but then you realize it wasn't as effective as they thought it was, but they never changed the bag out. Like, does it rely on more of corporations to follow suit and try and find ways to be able to be more sustainable as a company rather than using the same methods? I think during the lockdown, too, a good example is they had plastic bags get replaced with paper bags. Now, that lasted for a good little bit, but everyone hated the paper bags. They're like, this sucks. And it's like, yeah, because you haven't been conditioned to it. You've been conditioned to always use the plastic bag, so that's what you're used to. But after a while, you'll adapt to the brown paper bag, and you're not going to complain about it as much, and it actually might play a small role, but a giant impact in the grand scale. It's all about these long-term things. Everyone wants it, like, we're not good people when it comes to like fourth quarter, like issues that are long problems. That's very hard for us to deal with. But if it's like fourth quarter, like you need to act now, we clear it up. We act. But I mean, then we have a complaint if it doesn't work out. We go, well, we didn't have enough time. Well, it's like you knew about this for 100 something years and you never did anything about it.
Yeah, no, I mean, you bring up this good issue around this multiplier effect, right? Like it's like individually, each of our actions doesn't have much, but as a collective, it can. And, the bag example is a good one. And I think that's something, at the level of, that's both at a level of like, what can we do as individuals, but also what should companies do? At the individual level, when you go to the CVS or the Walgreens or whatever, the store, and you got 3 items, just say no to the bag. Like, why do you need it? Just carry it out. If you've got 2 hands, use them, and then the other piece of it is getting companies to actually do something to act and change what they're making things out of. And I think societally changing how we interact with our consumption. I mean, some of it is like, we just need to consume less. There are a finite amount of resources on this planet. We can't keep using more and more of them all the time. We will outstrip the supply of resources we have if we keep demanding more.
When it comes to something that might have shocked you through your research, what's one thing that like really has kind of impacted you to make you kind of want to be so focused into this? Like I can just picture you one day just getting out of school and being like, this is the one thing I want to research. But something came across your way, and then I'm guessing through your research, you probably stumbled across multiple things that have really kind of illuminated a path to like at least trying to reduce a lot of like, it's not really like people want to eliminate the problem. I go, you can't. There's nothing in this world that's eliminated 100%, unless you're talking about like death. But when it comes to like reducing the impact that you have, when we talk about environmental stuff, you can reduce, you can make it very, very minimal. So where you're not leaving a giant, TNT sized hole.
I think the things that, I mean, what's really motivated me about in this field is just that, is the health aspect of it, and that these exposures we have, whether it's to tobacco smoke, to lead, to phthalates, or to other chemicals in our environment, they have effects on us. Sometimes they're not gigantic effects. They're not going to like knock you over dead tomorrow, usually. But they're going to have they can have these long-term effects on us, and they can affect us as a whole population. And those costs associated with it, both in terms of the personal costs to our individual health and our loved ones, is high as it is to our society, right? It costs a lot of money to treat diseases like diabetes. It costs a lot to treat and help children who have ADHD. And so, being able to reduce the impact of those diseases on health, on our society, is really important. And we know from lots of work that prevention is the much better avenue to do for any of these, right? The saying is, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Well, it's not. That's really the way to go with this. And they've shown this with lead. So lead that was in old paint and in gasoline. The costs associated with using lead on health, were astronomically high, in the order of billions of dollars lost in terms of productivity and IQ points. And, that's really staggering, that much money has been lost because we used something in our environment that was so toxic.
I would love to have been there when they figured out that you shouldn't paint your nursery with lead paint. Like just like that moment where like, oh my God, what have we just done? Like there was a old book. I forgot, man, must have been like I read it in high school or something, but it was about painters. Like women would paint, and as they would paint, they would lick the tip of their paintbrush because it would finite the brush to make it like a nice point. And their cheeks afterwards would be glowing from the paint that they were using was filled with lead. And you were just like, what is it like? This is a, I get it. More information comes out, more research is done. But I mean, what stops the damage? Like, for instance, like we could talk about a common example. I vape, I use nicotine, I do that. But that was influenced because a lot about smoking was all these cool mobsters and movies and these ideas of brainwashing you to think that smoking is cool. I mean, eventually you suffer from something later down the line, but that's brainwashing that's still rooted in our system today. I mean, that's why a lot of kids think it's cool when they see their parents smoke. Their parents like, don't do it. But it's kind of like coffee. Coffee's not exactly the best for you, but it's how the system is run. A lot of people drink caffeine more than people that don't drink caffeine.
Yeah, no, I mean, going back to your example about lead, it's interesting because, in this country, we made a decision to keep using lead in paint, and back in the early 1900s, many European countries decided not to use lead in paint. And so like, even though there wasn't a lot of research at that time about lead and its toxicity, there's this decision a long time ago in some places to just say, we're not going to use this. And they largely avoided the problems associated with lead paint. Granted, they kept using lead-based gasolines, but that's a pretty big decision to make at that point. Where and the costs were high here in this country. Yeah, and so it's again, and it just shows that in some cases, a lot of this is due to outsized corporate influence on policies and how things are implemented in this country.
Now, with future generations, are you seeing like more people suffering from like types of disorders? Like I have ADHD. I mean, it's a disorder in some sense. It's also beneficial if you use it to just never getting sleep and always kind of moving. It's miserable. But in a sense, like, are you seeing more kids grow up with disorders like that? Are you seeing more of a resilience in genetics when it comes to that? I mean, I have to think after a while, your body starts to adapt too. Especially if a woman who's pregnant, who's around something like that. I mean, you could see a whole host of issues that start to happen there. It's like fetal alcohol syndrome in a sense, is what I think of.
Yeah, so I don't think the genetic factors that like the a lot of the genetic factors can't explain what we're seeing. Genetics acts over millennia, long time spans. Chemicals and environmental factors and that we've been exposed to as humans have changed rapidly over the last 50 to 100 years, let's say. If we count from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So we're really not like genetics isn't going to play that big of a role over those types of time spans. And so what we see, the changes we're seeing are largely due to our environment. Now it's not to say that genetics doesn't play a role in these things, but for a lot of the things with genetics that we look at, genetics doesn't explain a lot of variation in common traits. Things like body mass index, like how much fat tissue do you have on your body. The genetics that we have don't explain, largely the individual variation between us doesn't explain a lot of that difference in our body mass index. Now, granted, and some environmental factors, are much more. So, and in terms of some of these disorders, we do see. I mean, we have seen, obesity has risen, globally in terms of its prevalence. Type 2 diabetes is going to become, one of the biggest killers on the planet. Likewise, we've seen increases in things like autism spectrum disorder. It's debatable as to why we've seen those increases. Things like ADHD are, largely stable now, but they were increasing for a while. And so, there's concern, even if these things aren't increasing, the fact that they're there, makes them, something that we have to help people with, and treat.
Well, to clarify on the environmental influences, are we talking about actual environment or are we just talking about the surrounding area that a person is in? Because I feel like that also influences a lot of your bad decisions and chemical usage as well, too.
Yeah, no, I mean, environment's broad, right? Like, I mean, what the circle you draw around your environment, how you define environment is really broad. When I think about environment, I'm thinking about chemicals, air pollution, water pollution, but your environment is bigger than that, as you point out, like where you live, right? The neighborhood you're in, and the experiences you have in it are tremendous, have a tremendous influence on you. Both in ways that are not necessarily directly like an environmental factor, like a chemical, but the stressors around you. The difference between I worked as a school nurse for years for a year in Milwaukee, and I mean there were kids at our school who there would be shootings in their neighborhoods at night, and that was their environment. I lived over in a different part where I didn't experience shootings at night. I mean that's a very different environment, and that has a profound effect on children to be experiencing that level of violence in your neighborhood. And so those are those are other environmental factors that we often think about, and they often come together, right? Like, you're not just ever exposed to one thing. You're never just exposed to like just lead, you're exposed to a whole suite of things all at once. A mixture is what we like to call it. And so what we're becoming increasingly interested in is figuring out what is the impact of that mixture, of this environmental mixture we live in. So, all of the chemicals I'm exposed to, all of the air pollutants, all of the psychosocial stressors, like the violence in my neighborhood, the ability to walk, how do those all influence my health?
Well, it's kind of like you need to choose where to lay your base. And sadly, if you want to choose to lay your base in a city, you have to worry about the environmental factors of people, your stressful situations. Even if in New York, they had that study about brake dust, where they were talking about the brake dust that's in people's lungs. Now, whether that's a real study or not, I remember reading it about the amount of brake dust in New York from all those stopping cars that just go real quick and then stop, go real quick and then stop. That inhaling that, and also their cigarette usage is a little bit insane. That's how I first got started. Was I worked with a bunch of people from New York, and they would always go out, and that's how you bond. That's how you connect with people. Uh, but then if you talk about laying your base in a more away, isolate type place out in the mountains or something like that, you also have to worry about all the corporations that are out there doing things that they don't want the public to see when it comes to where do we put our solar panels? Where do we put all these machines or factories? And we put them in areas that aren't near cities because people don't want to see it. We don't want to see a factory next to our home. So you put it out in the environment. Then you go out there to move out there and you have all these chemicals that are floating in the air. I mean, asthma, for instance, is probably the clearest example. How many people are developing asthma? It doesn't just come with birth. You can develop that.
Mm-hmm. No, and I think that's there's I think it's a great I think this is a great point about, where these things get located. There's the whole NIMBY thing, not in my backyard, right? You don't want the landfill, the medical waste incinerator, whatever. You don't want that in your backyard, whether you live in the city or in the country. But these, and often when companies, big corporations want to move these, large operations somewhere or build new ones, they often put it near the homes of poor people or people who are disenfranchised in some way, and which who typically tend to be, people who don't have as much power, whether it's not, blacks or people who are poor or whatnot. And, and I mean, that's just historically been the case. And you see that even with things like, they're manufacturing, they're building new, a colleague of mine is doing work down in Alabama or in Mississippi. And, they're building these wood pellet plants to make those little pellets of wood that you put into fireplaces to burn. They're being touted as a green industry, right? We're giving you this alternative way to heat your home. But what they're doing is they're putting these plants down in Mississippi where it's mostly, low income Black people. And they're noisy. They make a lot of pollution, and they deforest the area around them, right? Where do they get the trees? They cut down all the trees around them. So you're doing all this environmental damage and then turning it around and selling it as a green product, even though it's not.
So with corporations, like would it just fall on education as well too? Like if more people are educated, not about the dangers maybe in their lives, but about what corporations are maybe the right corporations, making them more accountable as well too. Like I don't like government interaction in it because I feel like they end up getting their palms greased at some aspects or some track of the road. But I feel like you need to have like a nonprofit or these types of institutions that do oversight into these companies as well too. Now I get we have environmental protection standards and these types of agreements that you got to go by, FDA regulations as well too. But man, there's a lot of stuff that slips through. There's a lot of stuff that is going on that I feel like is definitely unethical in a sense. And you can call a company green, but are they really green? Or are they doing one thing different than all the other companies you can call that green? Like that's what really kind of sucks is that we don't prioritize the people. And it's like with organic as well too. Organic's way more, but it's just like we don't make it an easy option. It's kind of like when you go to McDonald's and you ask for a salad over a cheeseburger. The salad's $7, but the cheeseburger's $1. I mean, you're not helping people out in this situation where you got people that want to be healthy, want to eat healthy. You might not have the time, and you don't give them the option to choose something that might be more beneficial or might help out in their life. Now, still, if you're getting a salad at McDonald's, you're trying, but it's still not a good deal.
No, and this is the thing is I think this goes back to the whole thing, like the plastic bags or the packaging, like you got, is giving people these options. I mean, an example of this that I'm aware of is, IKEA, the big furniture chain from Scandinavia, made this decision years ago with one class of these chemicals that I study called perfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS. And they wanted to get rid of PFAS in everything they made. And so they made this decision. They said, we're going to stop using PFAS. And so they went through and they looked at all the stuff they make and they said, where do we use PFAS? And then they went through and they said, okay, is there an alternative? Can we put something else on here that did what the PFAS did before? And if they could find it, they said, okay, great. We'll put that alternative on there as long as it's not toxic. And then we'll sell that. And if they couldn't, they said, we're just going to stop selling this. And then they're done. They moved on. And so, that's an example where, there's some branding in there, right? They want to sell more product and be green or whatever they want to call it, however you want to call it. But at the same time, they made a conscious decision to change something. And, they did something that wasn't typical, that most companies wouldn't do, which is to say, I'm going to stop selling the thing that's bad, even if it was making me money before. And I'm going to find alternatives for it. And so I think those are the sorts of things that companies can do that don't necessarily require government oversight. But if there were a set of standards to say, this is what, we should be doing, that's a way for people to do these things. And for companies to then put into practice things that reduce our exposure to these things, to harmful chemicals.
Well, it's like with the Arizona tea guys, the one with the 99-cent teas that you can always get. Now, pricing on everything went up like $1. Now they had the choice or option to raise their thing up $1, but they didn't, and because it's two brothers and their dad who own this company. Now it might be mass marketed as so, but they didn't want to raise the price of it because they kept it 99 cents. Only because I don't know if it was a benefit to just people, but I think it was more of an aspect of the money that they have, they're still able to feed their workers and they don't really care so much about just making a giant profit like most companies.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good, I mean, there's another example of just like, I think, I was of just the amount of, there's an aspect of greed or just this desire to always make more money. And that there's this, I mean, at some point, like how much money is too much money?
Makes the world run.
Um, It does, but at the same time, like, I mean, I think if you look at like certain recent billionaires who have so much money that they've had to design their own, space programs, I mean, that's sort of a sign you have too much money, right? Like, I mean, like when there's not enough yachts and enough houses that you have to then design a space program. Like, I mean, like, I mean, we're at this like level of comical absurdity almost with how much money these individuals have. And like, I mean, I tell my children this, like, like, I mean, like, think of all the good they could do with that money, but they choose not to. Right. And people have a choice to do that. So I think that's the thing, is that at the end of the day, everyone has a choice of what they can do. And some people, have more power in the types of choices they can make.
Are you coming across any research where people are working on like independent projects, or there's any researchers out there that are trying to eliminate more pollutants in a more, I mean, maybe not as known way? Like, I mean, even with those little, there's a little plug you get for your car, you can put it in that takes out smoke out of the air, like if someone's smoking in your car or something like that. Now, that's a small step for sure in going in the right direction of where we could see a lot of things go. And I just wonder if there's any researchers out there. I mean, I don't expect a billionaire to pluck one of these out of obscurity and fund them all this money and stuff like that. But I mean, it's definitely stuff where it should be more known that there are people out there that are trying to make a difference. Maybe not trying to stop a tree from being cut down, but trying to find effective ways to find alternative methods, especially with the topic of renewables. That topic has been littered with just so many voices that I just don't even see an answer being solved. Now, people could say, well, it's electric cars. It's like, maybe, but I mean, at this point, are we seeing the change happen as fast as it should be happening, as much as everybody's reporting it? You have a lot of people that could easily have the same goal in mind, but they all have different ways of achieving that goal. And it's like, would it be easier if we had an open platform to talk about those things? I mean, we still have coal plants and facilities that, in a sense, when you hear the word clean coal, it's like they have a filter on top. What does that honestly do? Maybe it filters out some of it, but there's still pollutants in giant areas, and these do fall on corporations that want to make money. They want to do it as fast as possible, and they don't really care if it pollutes or contaminates a whole lake or river. There was just that article that came out like a month and a half ago or something like that, where they were dumping toxic waste or something in a river, and it was caught, and there was like a $200,000 fine or something like that from the government.
Yeah, no, so let me go back to one of your earlier points about people trying to do stuff. So our research group has tried to do work to reduce environmental exposures in people at the individual level, and there's others do this as well. There's actually several groups around the country that do this, and other researchers around the world. And one of the things we've investigated is, can we do things like, we've done interventions to reduce lead exposure in children by, eliminating sources of lead paint in kids' homes to prevent lead poisoning. We've also done, there's been groups from a group of researchers at the Silent Spring Institute in Massachusetts who have done work to give organic or packaging-free diet to people to try to reduce their exposure to phthalates and bisphenol A. And they found, if you reduce the amount of packaged and processed food in people's diets, they have reduced levels of exposure to phthalates and bisphenol A. I mean, it makes sense, but they showed you can do it, and it works. We're doing some work right now to look at air filters, to see if we can filter indoor air with, they're described as a janky air filter. We built these really low tech air filters where we just take furnace air filters and tape them together and put a box fan on top, and they filter the air. And so we're seeing, can we reduce indoor air pollutants with those? So there's lots of people out there looking at things like diet, personal care products, cleaning products. There's a group out at UC Berkeley who's doing work around cleaning products and personal care products to see, can we reduce people's exposure to lots of different chemicals just by changing, using different things, or putting things in their homes to reduce their exposure by, through air filtration or cleaning. And I think those are things individuals can do, and being able to provide people with an avenue if they're concerned about chemicals or things in their environment. I think the big question, though, is like, is it everyone's responsibility to do this, right? Is it your responsibility or my responsibility to have to go and reduce my exposure to every single chemical? Or should we have something in place that makes sure that those things just aren't being used?
Well, I mean, it was easy to ramp people up. Like even during the pandemic, for instance, how many people were dumping bleach on like everything, or were doing something using a lot of chemicals to clean off? I know people that were you'd use bleach every single day to wipe off this certain area. I work at a gym, so you had to wipe off a certain area with bleach. I mean, you're breathing that in. I mean, you put it down for a second, you get like a head high. And it's like you're not sitting there going to sniff it like you would sniff a Sharpie or something like that, like some people would. I'm not saying I would. But I'm saying it's that dumb stuff or those types of things where I get the point is to reduce risk or reduce all this type of stuff. But there wasn't a lot of thought that was being put into that. They were like, oh, you don't have to wipe down surfaces anymore. It's like we got to be careful with the amount of how easy we use a product or we use some type of thing to immediately fix an issue. Like chemicals, for instance, is the biggest one. Is we use bleach on everything to clean things. It cleans it really well. It really does a great job. But it's like when we talk about glyphosate. I mean, there's issues when it comes down to these chemicals and stuff where we don't really know the full toxicity of what this is going to be doing to our system. Now, if you have a kid that's around the smell of bleach, maybe it's a new school and you want to keep it clean or something like that, but they're smelling that and it's like it reeks. And it's just like a bad smell. It doesn't go away, but it also causes damage. They're breathing that in their lungs.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think this is where, finding alternatives. We know that some things that I think we know from the experience of the pandemic, all of us know that there was widespread use of cleaning agents in people's homes, whether it was bleach or other cleaning products. And this was, we were flying blind really at that point, I mean, at that time in March 2020, we really didn't know what we were dealing with. So people were, acting, really with a lot of caution. And it's changed, right? Like that's what science does. Science adapts, and we figured out we didn't need to do that, and that's great. We didn't need to keep engaging in that sort of hygiene theater. But at the same time, you're right. Like there are certain things we do use even when we're cleaning that could be potentially harmful. And something like bleach is an example where it is toxic at high levels. You don't want to be sitting there inhaling over the bottle of bleach all day. And so, what are there alternatives? And I think this is what we need to be figuring out is what are the alternatives that we can use.
Have you researched into like the most common exposures? I know we said lead paint earlier, but like even with cleaning products, like is there a trigger from maybe a mother who is pregnant or maybe kids, for instance, that are going out and are little kids or something like that? Like, is there harmful chemicals that are affecting them later stages in life? Is there a correlation with any of this?
Yeah, so we've done a lot of work looking at things. Lead is a classic example where we and others have shown that lead exposure during childhood is related to increased risk of behavioral problems. It's related to reductions in IQ, things like your ability to remember and learn things. It's associated with just general behavior problems. Even out, I have colleagues who have done work where they've shown that lead exposure during early childhood is related to having increased risk of being arrested when you're an adult. So children who get exposed to lead tend to then have more aggressive behaviors that then translate into worse and worse behaviors as they get older, and they follow this trajectory where they go from being the kid who has ADHD to being the kid who's being arrested later on in life. And that's not to say every kid with ADHD goes on to get arrested, but they're at heightened risk for it if they continue on that trajectory. And lead sets them up on that trajectory. And we've looked at other chemicals. We've found that things like bisphenol A is associated with behavior problems in children, particularly in girls. There's evidence that some of these chemicals I was talking about, these perfluoroalkyl substances, these are immunotoxicants, and there's evidence that they reduce our response to vaccines that we're getting. They also seem to be associated with changes in they increase the amount of lipids in our blood, the harmful lipids that can make us at risk of heart attacks and stroke and things like that. So there's lots of these chemicals out there that could potentially affect us. And many of these we think could have a greater effect on the developing fetus or infant because they're just more susceptible to those chemicals. They're getting more of it per unit body mass, and that they're sensitive at those life stages because they're undergoing rapid development and everything's changing so quickly that their body is just very sensitive to environmental inputs.
Now, why is it specifically behavioral problems? Like, why are you noticing a correlation with like lead paint and behavioral problems? Because my dumb example is like lead, I think of metal and I go, oh, they're acting metal, which is like hard or tough.
Yeah, I don't know why, there's other toxic metals out there that have seen similar effects, things like cadmium. For lead, the mechanism, there are people who have proposed certain mechanisms. It does seem to interfere with certain certain parts of the brain, reduce certain volumes, areas, reduces the area or the size of certain areas of the brain. And some of these areas of the brain are related to things like behavioral regulation, like regulating your feelings and emotions. And in other cases, we're not always clear what the mechanism is. But behavior seems to be sensitive. So does the brain in terms of learning and memory seems to always be sensitive as well. So it varies. Not every chemical, it's behavior. Some of these chemicals I mentioned, these perfluoroalkyl substances, they don't seem to be associated with a lot of things related to the brain. They seem to be associated more with things related to our metabolism, like risk for diabetes. So there's been now 3 studies that have come out in the last couple of years showing that adults exposed to these perfluoroalkyl substances are at increased risk of diabetes. Again, this is like going to be the leading cause of death and disability in the world. And, these substances that we've been using for 50, 60 years, are maybe partly responsible for diabetes. So, this can have a profound effect on our health and our planet.
I mean, is there any measure? Or is it just based on a person's body? Like when we look at like a number of increase in diabetes from those peripheral, I can't even say the name of it, but that substance you just mentioned, PFAS. With PFAS, if you can notice like a strong correlation with diabetes, now is there a certain profile that these people fit in? Like are the certain area that they live in? Is it a common aspect, or is it just a contaminant of these substances? Because I mean, would me being 24 have the same, I guess, outcome as someone who's exposed to the same chemicals as someone who might be in their 30s? I mean, I understand it's like a genetic roll of the dice as well, too. Your genetics probably plays a factor that you just can't really correlate with. But I mean, if there's a strong correlation of this thing increasing in diabetes, is it just strictly that? Is it just metabolistic issues, or is there other issues in there as well, too? I mean, we don't know where cancer comes from. We know we can get smoking is probably a cause of it, and there's other factors out there that are causes of it, but we don't have a lot of this stuff narrowed down, because I think a lot of it is kind of like, yeah, but we can relate it to this. It could be that, but it's multifactorial. That's what the word is.
No, you're right. I mean, it is multifactorial. There's lots of, I mean, with every disease, we're dealing with some degree of this multifactorialism, right? Where there's lots of things that can cause a disease. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that one thing can't be a cause, but figuring that out. And with few exceptions, you will never know like what caused your diabetes. With the case of these PFAS, though, we do see now consistently, that it does seem, at least in adults, sort of midlife adults, that they seem to be at increased risk. Whether it's going to be the same for a 24-year-old or not, hopefully we can do studies of that. And there's, I'm interested, and others are interested to now know, well, what about your exposure prenatally? Does your exposure prenatally to these chemicals increase your risk of diabetes as an adult? And that's the sort of stuff that's, that's what's frightening is, if these exposures have these long-term health effects, the sort of things that, your mother and my mother was exposed to, have long-term implications for our health going forward, for another, 40, 50, 60 years. And then we have to be thinking too about what's the impact on our children, so, what our babies are exposed to, could have impacts on their health going forward, 80 years. And so those are the sorts of questions that I think are really, important to address, but they're also really hard to address, right? Those sorts of studies don't just happen. You can't just simply just wave a wand and do those sorts of studies. They take a long time to do.
I mean, have you seen a turnaround, at least with mothers that are being more cautious about what they're putting into their bodies? Because I think with the amount of information, amount of research, amount of media that's kind of been showing a little bit about this stuff, they probably should be showing a lot more when it comes to their headlines. They tend to skew one certain way. But when it comes to at least mothers that are coming up, I know plenty of them, plenty of my friends, for instance, that are having kids, and they're more worried, more conscious about these certain things as well, too, whether it's pumping gas. Some people won't even fill up their own car just because they're afraid of. Now, that might be oversensitive. I don't know. But I mean, if you really understand the effects and what damage it could possibly be doing to something that's growing inside of you, I mean, that's a big thing you should be cautious for as well, too. But I honestly think you can get the same damage at a gas pump as you can at your house as well, too. I just don't know what those things are that we're using that to be able to eliminate from that. Like I was mentioning to you before, hairspray. That's a big one that everyone used in the 90s and 80s. It's like you got to really look and examine, like, yeah, we know that's bad now, and maybe we don't use as much hairspray, but there are so many other factors. A sage candle, anything. any of those smelly stuff, like the stuff that's really potent and stuff. Artificial sweeteners are littered in every single thing. I'm a fault. I like a Pepsi. Come on. Artificial sweetener in that Pepsi. I can taste it sometimes, but it's good. And I'm brainwashed into consuming that product. I mean, it just becomes this inevitable thing where the only thing you can have in your house people think of is water. And then you can look at the stuff about water. Are there minerals in your water that might necessarily not be the best ones? So you're telling me I have to buy a marketed volcano ash water? I don't like that. I'm just landing in this area where there's like a lot of like it's literally like a spider web. You're taking a step and you come across this issue that's linked to this issue that's linked to this issue.
Yeah, no, I mean, you hit a couple of important points there. I think one of them is, there's this issue of like, like what do we tell people, like, and what do you do? Because, there's just so much, right? Like it's overwhelming. How do you make decisions about what exposures to avoid? And pregnant women are a great example, are great, sort of are a target of who are often a target population who are concerned about those things because they have a baby in them. And they're thinking, gosh, what do I, what should I do? And there's only so much they can do, right? You have only so much time and money and resources, and you can't do everything. I mean, I think that the simple messaging I always give people is that, put a water filter on your water, on your tap water, whatever the faucet based ones, or you can buy the pitcher ones. Those are great. Those are, it's a simple way to reduce your exposure to any contaminants that might be in your water that you drink, from around you. That's simple. And it covers lots of things. It'll get rid of lots of different chemicals that could be in your water. The other one is, to eat a balanced diet, right? Like don't go overkill on one thing, the volcano ash water or the sugar sweetened beverages, right? I like Diet Coke, but I don't go overkill on it. But don't eat all tuna, right? Just or all something. Balance. You're sort of hedging when you eat a balanced diet. And then the other one is, keep your house, clean and free of dust, because we think that a lot of these pollutants might be coming from dust and air. And so using a HEPA vacuum, so a vacuum cleaner that has a HEPA filter on it, most old, the old school vacuum cleaners that don't have the HEPA filters, they just shoot all that hot air out of the back end of them. So they're just blowing all the chemicals back out into your house. So if you put a HEPA filter on them that keeps, that reduces the amount of those chemicals being blown out into the air. So those are like three really simple things people can do. They don't cost a lot of money. And they cover you for lots of different chemicals. I think then you can get into this next tier of things where you can be like, well, I'm really worried about pesticides or bisphenol A or phthalates. And then you can start saying, okay, I'm going to eat organic to reduce my pesticide exposure, or I'm going to, use certain personal care products and makeup and hairsprays that don't have phthalates in it. But then you're starting to like get into the weeds, right? And that's where you could drive yourself crazy.
Well, even with dust, for instance, how do you eliminate dust if you live in a giant home? I mean, you have someone that's got to be like, I got to clean this. And then you're sitting there cleaning off. Like, there are so many things. I didn't realize how much things get dusty unless when you start getting older, you start cleaning up your own place and you're like, holy shit, like everything that I haven't touched in like 5 minutes can get dusty in a sense. And you realize that that's a factor that you never even thought of. Like when you're a kid and you're running around, you just figured the house magically stayed clean. But besides the mess that you make, you know what I mean? But when it comes to dust, that's everywhere. It's on people's fans. I guarantee anybody listening right now to go check their bathroom air filter or whatever it is, or check anything that you just leave on and expect it to be like, oh, it's okay. It's okay. It's dirty. And it's not dirty and like, oh, it's just dirty. No, it's dirty. It's really bad. And you're breathing that in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no. And I think you try to do the best you can. And that's why, and that's why, that's one of the things we're really interested in now is can air filtration help? Or is air filtration one way to reduce people's exposure to chemicals? And we're trying to do studies now to look at that, because I think that's really, that's something simple, and it might be, and it has sort of like there's sort of co-benefits to it, right? You can both reduce your risk of, reduce your exposure to pollutants in your home. Maybe if you live near a busy roadway, like a freeway or highway, you might reduce your exposure to the traffic related pollutants. And if for things like, if you're worried about COVID and you have people over in your house, keeping the air moving and circulated is going to reduce the risk of transmitting COVID among people. So I think there's reasons to use, something like air filtration. And so I think there's increasing interest in those sorts of things to reduce lots of different exposures or risks.
When it comes to environment, like when someone takes a step outside and takes a nice deep breath, I mean, is that actually beneficial? Like I always say that's like my calming point is being able to go outside and really like breathe in the air. I live by the ocean, so it's like a very fresh and like salty kind of air. I mean, getting to a point where you're eventually going to see a decline in the amount that it's actually helping people. Like my grandmom, for instance, if we move or we travel to Hawaii like we've done before, she can breathe fine. She doesn't need her inhaler. But when she gets back into, even if she lives out in the country, she still needs her inhaler. It's just a different type of air out there. And that is the exposure. It's just like with plastics, for instance, and Singapore and some other countries that have a high usage of plastics. It's very harder for them to have kids, or their fertility count's a little bit lower than ours, for instance, depending on how much your plastic usage is. With air quality, I mean, environment, is that eventually going to get to a point where all these people that say meditating outside and being one with the universe is eventually going to be not so good for you anymore? Like, does it help clear out a lot? I feel like whenever I go outside and take a deep breath, it clears out a lot of the crap. You know what I mean? Especially if you're smoking a cigarette outside, you just take one puff and then you take a giant puff of the air, the clean air.
Yeah, I know. I think it's an interest. I mean, there is. I mean, I think the one thing that's been of interest now more recently, you talking about being near the ocean, is this interest in what we call blue and green space. People having access to green spaces around them, as well as blue space, which is being near water. Green spaces being parks and forests and trails and things. And I think we're finding increasingly that there's benefits to living near those sorts of natural phenomenon, or natural, our natural environment. Why that is, I don't know. Is it just that there's less exposure to pollutants and noise when you live near a green space? Or is it that there's really something truly remarkable about being near there's something about that sort of mind-body connection to our outer environment? And maybe it's a little bit of all of it, but I think there is interest in it. And there's more people doing research on that. I mean, there's a study in Spain showing that kids who live near closer to green space have better attention and less sort of ADHD like symptoms or problems with paying attention and inhibiting their behaviors. So there is a benefit to it. And so I think that's one way we might be able to dampen some of the effects of some of these exposures is if we can access those spaces more, or make sure people have access to them.
Have you been worried about medications influencing, like, how we're so quick to give a medication to like younger generations? I've seen studies from like John Hopkins where it's getting difficult for men to have like arousal issues even at such a young age, only because the amount of like antidepressants that people are on, the amount of anxiety pills that people are on as well too. I start to wonder, like, what's that going to play in the long run?
Yeah, I don't know that research, but it is something I recall. I remember when I was a school nurse in Milwaukee, we had a lot of kids who were on medications there. And, I mean, they were, your standard ADHD medications that have been prescribed to kids for a long time. But, these are psychoactive substances, and we're giving them to young developing brains. And I don't think we really know what the long-term implications of that are. And I mean, on top of that, I would see some kids who would be on, antipsychotics because they had behavior problems. And there were some antipsychotics that were prescribed for kids with ADHD or other behavior problems. And again, I don't think we understand really what the long-term implications of doing that is. And again, like that's sort of taking the environmental example to the extreme, where, we're exposed to these environmental things that are sort of, might be biologically active in us or have effects on us. But, in contrast, pharmaceuticals, they're designed to be active, right? They're designed to do stuff in your body and to change you. And so that, I think, those are the sorts of questions I think that are also interesting to figure out is some of this, because in this country, we do use a lot of prescription medications and give them to potentially vulnerable groups like children.
Well, even like you were mentioning with lead paint and all the cognition issues that people are having, or behavioral issues that people are having. See, we think of the physical stuff, like a baby that's born and has maybe an atrophied arm or something that is very, very clear and noticeable. But we don't talk about invisible illnesses. I mean, as much as we say we're a mental health society, I mean, yeah, we like to think that we are, but there's still a lot of understanding when it comes to, we need more information on a lot of stuff too. Invisible illnesses is a key one. There are issues that people are suffering with, like a intestinal issue that maybe their intestine doesn't work or something like that. We don't even take those into account. We don't take into account so things we can't see, because we can't just like expect someone to have these types of things. But we're starting to enter a world. I remember when I started having digestive issues, there was a lot of people that were coming out like, oh yeah, I got a piece of my intestine taken out when I was like 20. I was like, what? Like, why is everyone having digestive issues? Now, my correlation is obviously you can link it to the artificial sweeteners. That's in everything. But I mean, there's so many factors out there. Like we said, the multifactorial thing, where I think there's going to be a bigger recognition about cognition or cognition issues, which I mean just comes with the brain development. I mean, we're all aware like there's crucial parts about a baby's life when there's their brain developing, and they say your brain doesn't develop until you're 24. But it's like, yeah, but imagine something being messed up at such a young age. I mean, ADHD is really not a big, like I have it, but it's not like a huge cognition issue when it comes to not being able to decipher certain information because your brain can't process it properly. I mean, those are fears that you got to worry about. And those are fears that don't just stop in your development stages. They go on into you later in your life, Alzheimer's disease, all these things that they're still trying to figure out.
No, I think the sort of I like that analogy that saying invisible illness. I think we people gravitate towards the things that that are sort of the health effects that are the worst, right? Cancers, birth defects. Those are the sorts of things people think about when they think about it. A lot of times when they think about environmental pollutants, or the other one I think a lot of people think about is fertility. You brought up fertility, right? Those are the ones that are sort of get everyone's attention, but it's these things that are less visible. Declines in cognition, ADHD behaviors, intestinal issues, or things that take a long time to develop, like Alzheimer's. And I think that's the big question is like, what's the implication of being exposed to something that decreases your cognition a little bit when you're a kid? Let's say 5 IQ points, which you and I could wake up tomorrow morning and we wouldn't know that we lost like 5 IQ points. I need all of them I can get, but if I lost, you wouldn't really know. But what's the implication of that as I get older? When I'm 42, I turned 60, 70, and now my cognition starts declining. Maybe I hit Alzheimer's a little earlier because I was 5 IQ points lower than what I should have been. Had I not lost those 5 IQ points, I would have never gotten Alzheimer's before I died, but now I have it. So what's that implication for us when we do that to a whole population? So let's take 1 million people and make them lose 5 IQ points. How many more of them are going to get Alzheimer's? How many more of them are going to have disease and disability later in life because of that? And that's the thing that motivates me, is that we could really make profound impacts on health if we can change those sorts of exposures that, affect invisible illness.
Well, it's making society a more healthy society, not just in the basic methods if you need to go to the gym and lose weight, but it's also recognizing the damage that we're doing with the things that we use. We learn a lot about how to use a tool, but we don't learn the full extents when it comes to what that tool can eventually impact us with, you know? But I would like to see a study done on the amount of tinnitus that people are going to be experiencing as they get older. I've been wondering this for the longest time because ever since I heard of it, and this is gonna be like a weird little tangent, but the guy who worked at Texas Steakhouse or Longhorn, is that what it's called? Do you know what I'm talking about?
I think so.
He died of tinnitus. Like he ended up taking his own life because he was suffering from that tinnitus condition with the ringing ear thing. So I was like, how many times I have headphones in my head all day, like doing the podcast. When I'm at work, I have headphones in my head. When I'm working out, I have headphones in my head. When I'm in my room watching TV, I have headphones in my head just because I don't even really listen to TV. I'm just listening to something. So then when I take my earplugs out at night and I go and lie down on my bed, I hear a faint ringing in my ear. And I'm like, is that tinnitus? I don't want to die. So then I look it up and it's damaged ear, like the hair in your ears. There's follicles in there that are damaged. And I'm like, is that permanent? And they're like, well, no, you can tune it out. Sometimes it'll be really loud and sometimes it'll be this. Not everybody has like this ongoing condition. It'll end up fixing itself most of the time. But it says at every point in some person's life, they suffer for like a small bit of time, this form of ear ringing or this form of tinnitus type thing. And I go, is that going to affect future generations when you talk about how much we're using our devices on so many things? I mean, every kid now, they play their iPad, put headphones in their head. That wasn't like that so long ago. I wonder if you're going to see a spike in cases go up. I mean, maybe I'm predicting the future. I don't know.
No, I think that's another example of sort of this invisible illness, a tinnitus, but also hearing loss. Everyone's walking around with headphones in all the time now. And, volume, there's a reason why they put volume control settings on kids' headphones. I can say this having a 7 and a 3-year-old. If they had their choice, they would have those things cranked up all the time. But, and so I think that's a concern is sort of, our environment has changed around us in the last 5-10 years with everyone using AirPods or whatever, wireless, headphone they use or wired. And And that could affect how your hearing going forward in 20, 30, 40 years, because you've got that in there all the time and you've got the volume just a little too loud, right? And it's not that it's not like you're sitting in a rock concert all day, but it's just maybe a couple decibels too loud for you, and you lose those hair cells. So I think, it's interesting hearing in sort of our sensations, our sensory experiences, our health outcome that I don't think we pay a lot of attention to, whether it's taste or smell. Smell recently because of COVID, right? But we don't do a lot of studies of those, of people's sensory experiences.
And especially when it comes to, like you mentioned earlier, about like talking about people with like lead paint and in your homes and stuff of that sort. If they knew that there was information out there for more alternative methods of a way to be able to use that same product but not get the exposure risk, or maybe reduce their risk a little bit more, you'll have more people spend the extra dollar or so to be able to make sure they don't have that risk. But you have a lot of people buying into something that aren't even aware of the risks that are associated with it. Like, I vape, but I know the risk with vaping. A lot of people vape. I mean, that's probably going to be a more common one you'll know the risk to, because it's kind of told to you when you get the product and it's labeled on there. But I also think that comes with a lot of things that you get. I mean, spray paint, for instance, for the longest time, people were just working in spray paint shops, and eventually they're like, oh, I should wear a mask, or I should wear something to be able to funnel out this chemical that's being, you're breathing it in all the time. It's not good. I think that just comes with better education, but I feel like people, like, it's not a laziness factor. It's just people that aren't aware of the issues that they're using. And sadly, we've made the issues or the biggest products for the public. That's our consumer stuff. That's McDonald's example I gave you earlier. It's an easy option to choose the bad thing over the good thing. I mean, if we make it the same price, I guarantee to you, even if people want to spend an extra dollar or two more, they will, just to make sure they can protect themselves in the long run.
Yeah, and I think some of this is too, this sort of this nature of what's voluntary and involuntary, right? Like, you choose to vape, and people choose to drink, they choose to use cannabis or whatnot, and there's risks, and people by and large are informed of those risks and or know what could happen for doing that. But then some of the other things, people have no choice, right? We have no choice of whether we're exposed to air pollution, right, or to some of the chemicals that are just put into every product. We don't have any choice, and we don't even know necessarily always. And so those are the things that, when it's a choice versus not a choice, that makes it, I think, more important as to why we should protect people when people can't have a choice in that. And that's where we need either regulation or policies that protect people from those things.
Well, Joe, it's been a pleasure chatting with you, man. Is there a place where people can find you? You got any links you want to promote? Twitter?
I am on Twitter.
Yes.
Joseph M. Braun 1. It's Joseph M. Braun 1, and that's with the @ symbol. That's probably the best place to find me for anything science related.
Joseph M. Braun.
Braun, Braun, number 1. Let me double check and make sure that's actually right, because I always forget my Twitter handle.
Are you giving me a fake profile?
No, it's real. Yeah.
That's why you copycat out there.
Yeah, right. I don't have any bots following me, hopefully.
I'll link all your links in the description. Joe, it's been a pleasure chatting with you, and thanks for listening